Welcome to Epg Pathshala. I am Dr. Shoma Chaudhary Lahiri and I teach Sociology at the Department of Sociology, St. Xavier's College, Kolkata. Today I will be talking to you about the module which is titled Cultural Strategies, Techniques and Used in a Social Movement, which forms part of the paper on social movements in India, wherein I will go on to elaborate how social movements use cultural strategies, tactics, techniques, etc. In order to shape its own identity as well as the identity of the actors who are participants in a social movement. Generally, in social movement studies, the larger framework has been animated by a structural understanding of social movements. So much so that cultural understandings of why people participate, how do they participate, how do they draw on their cultural ideas and resources and symbols was missing. And following the cultural turn in sociology and social sciences, today we have a focus on ways in which culture influences social movements, the interplay of culture and social movements, and the influence of actors' beliefs, actors' ideas, actors' cultures on the making of a social movement. There are four ways in which culture operates, and these are, as in this particular module, are framing, processes of framing, collective identity, emotions, and repertoires of action. Now, when one talks of framing in social movements, one specifically is looking at how a particular issue is framed. But before I go on to actually the framing processes, I need to mention why these emerged. Why did these important themes become important in social movement analysis? And this is because social movements were analyzed in terms of either the resources that they mobilized, which helped them to sustain themselves, or in terms of political opportunities and political process theories, which analyzed how movements emerged and took advantage of particular moments in sort of getting a new lease of life, in sort of how political processes played a role in their emergence. What was neglected was how culture plays a role, and therefore following the influence of the cultural turn and drawing from the interactionist school, primarily Goffman's ideas of how meanings are constructed, social constructionist analysis, and such other influences, we now have the importance of culture in social movements being sort of discussed and foregrounded in social movement studies. As far as framing is concerned, framing is a process by which meaning is generated. Why does a particular frame become important? How does a particular frame used such that it resonates with people's ideas, people's beliefs, and how does a particular frame used in social movements sort of involve the participation of people, more and more people? They are able to recruit more and more people into the movement and sort of make the movement achieve its goals over a period of time. Generally, there are certain scholars who are associated with the process of framing, namely Gamson and Snow, Bedford and Snow, and such others who talk in the West, who talk of the importance of the framing perspective in social movements. Before I go on to discussing the importance of framing emotions, repertoires of action, and forms of protest, I would like to mention two important aspects which are of significance here. One is why did meaning making in social movements become important, and how did social construction theories enable social movement theorists to focus on meaning making. Now, generally in social movement studies, the focus has been on human beings as rational actors, human beings participating in social movements as rational actors, therefore participation being rational decisions that human beings have made. And what was neglected was the role of emotions, the role of why people find it meaningful to participate in social movements, and hence the set of theories under social construction, social constructivist theories enabled the social movement theorists to talk about the identity of social movements. Now, what kind of identities do social movements give to people, and in turn what kind of identities do social movements acquire over a period of time? This became a focus with the help of these theories of construction, theories of social construction. The other thing that became very important was the importance of culture and what does culture involve. But here I would like to also focus that during this time, that is in the 1970s and the 80s, the change in focus in thinking on social movements was also from a state-centric view towards mapping how cultural attitudes were being shaped by social movements, and hence the focus on identity formation and meaning making, role of motivation, the role of emotions, the kind of tactics and strategies and so on, which make a social movement different and unique and particular in the way in which they protest. Here I would like to quote Pauletta and Jasper, Armstrong and Bernstein here, when they say that the question of cultural traditions, ideological principles, institutional memories and political taboos influence perceptions of movement actors and also create political opportunities. Culture also affects the origins, trajectories and outcomes of social movements, and culture also facilitates or impedes collective action. These scholars regard culture as a resource. They feel that culture is patterned, culture enables, culture also constrains, and hence the conception of culture is very important in social movements. While conceptualizing culture, we have to acknowledge that the term culture has been defined in different ways by different people, but here in the context of social movements it would refer to symbolic expressions of people's cultural behavior. Now there are two dimensions of culture which have to be recorded here. One is the systemic understanding of culture, which basically looks at the influence of culture as a whole on social movements. It does not look at the diversity between actors or strategies or particular techniques that they use, but it looks at culture as it uses culture as a systemic device to influence in general terms how culture influences a particular movement. So for example, how do political cultures of particular societies influence social movements in those societies? So it looks at culture in a holistic fashion. The second dimension of culture, which is more interesting and of use in this particular context, is the performative aspect of culture. So the performative dimension of culture draws from the Max Weber's perspective, wherein the culture is used as a form of a resource, as a toolkit, as whereby rituals, symbols, stories and worldviews are used by people to construct strategies of action. This is a more interesting process whereby everyday forms of action that are important for being a part of a social movement are drawn from the cultural repositories, the cultural stock of knowledge that actors have. And here the forging together or the bringing together of culture, strategy and political process is a very important concept. It's a very important endeavor, significant endeavor, because then it brings in different perspectives together. Framing perspectives generally have drawn from Goffman's idea of interaction and framing, where he talks of framing as schemata of interpretation, whereby what becomes important is to look at movement actors as active agents who are involved in the production and maintenance of meaning for constituents, antagonists and bystanders or observers. This is a quote given by Benford and Snow. So therefore framing is an active process, and it implies bringing in the actor's point of view, giving importance to the actor more than the structures that are in which the actor is embedded. It focuses on the way in which an actor is situated in a particular social reality, and therefore frames are always fluid, frames are always evolving, frames are not fixed, and in the fact that frames evolve, frames are not directly related to social reality as empirical objects. The process of evolution of frames is often contentious. There are multiple frames which exist at any point of time, and the choice of a particular framework for framing an issue has to be negotiated. It's a dynamic and an evolving process. Now, movement actors often refer to collective action frames, and these collective action frames are action-oriented sets of beliefs and meanings that inspire and legitimate the activities and campaigns of a social movement organization. So therefore, again, what is being emphasized is an active engagement. What is being emphasized is the actor's point of view. What is being emphasized is the negotiations that are involved in the process of framing, and what is also being emphasized is the existence of multiple frameworks at any one point of time. Now, another thing which sort of becomes important to to mention is that therefore social movements do not necessarily always emerge as a result of a structural strain. They may emerge as a result of a structural strain. They may get a new lease of life because of the political processes and opportunities that exist. But what is also important is the way in which they are framed so that they establish a particular meaning for their own participants. They become meaningful for their own participants. There are also motivational frameworks within social movements which actively motivate the recruits to engage in collective action of particular kinds, and these collective action frames, as they are called, they involve core framing tasks which include prognostic, diagnostic and motivational framing, meaning whereby meanings are derived and transformed through social interaction and through differential interpretations. So therefore meaning making is a negotiated, contested, modified process. It is articulated and re-articulated. It is socially constructed and deconstructed and reconstructed at any one point of time. We'll understand the process of framing through the help of particular examples. Now, here I take the example of a particular farmers' movement in Karnataka, which was led by Karnataka Rajya Rayata Sangha and KRRS. Now KRRS it consisted of rich and middle peasants, rich farmers and middle peasants in Karnataka, who were worried, or who actively mobilized themselves around the anti-GMO GM crop campaign. Now, in this particular movement, there were multiple frames. Now, one of the reasons why one of the frameworks why the GM crop was being opposed was because of reasons of health. In the sense that BT brinjal and BT cotton have gone through different kinds of field trials in different parts of the country, and it has also actively faced resistance from farmers, from NGOs, from academics, from scientists, and various other constituencies. Now, how is an active frame created? So, in the movement, one of the people who supported the infusion of biotechnology in agriculture had two kinds of reasons, provided two kinds of reasons. One was that the infusion of biotechnology would increase food production, and secondly, the BT cotton or BT brinjal has a chemical which would then be resistant to pests. So therefore, it would lead to increase in yield. But the farmers were protesting because the seeds would be manufactured, the seeds would not be saved, and it is the active infusion of technology which would then sort of disempower the farmers, they were unsure of how cultivating BT brinjal or BT cotton would affect their land, would affect the soil. So the Karnataka Rajya Rayata Sangha was quite strategic under the leadership of Nanjundaswamy, and the way in which they framed their campaigns and their slogans. So they thought that not being allowed to cultivate whatever one wanted to cultivate in one's own way was equivalent to losing one's own freedom. So harking back to Western imperialist domination, harking back to the idea of loss of freedom was a very powerful kind of framework which enabled the mobilization of many farmers in the campaign, because because people were reminded of the fact that they had once lost their freedom, and so it was buried deep in their memory, and hence the call for freedom from the role of Western companies like Monsanto, DuPont, and such Syngenta and others led to a very active mobilization strategy amongst the farmers and also other constituents of society. So therefore, strategies of framing were used in very powerful ways to motivate people in the farmers' movement. Now one goes on to the idea of collective identity and how it is important in social movements. Now, like culture, collective identity is also a slippery concept in the sense that it is something that has to be forged. It is something that has to evolve. It is created, it is generated in the course of the growth and development of a social movement. And here collective identity is not a mere collection or accretion of individual identities. It is much more than individual identities, and here culture plays a role in the sense that because collective identities are developed and sustained with the help of culture. Why are collective identities important? They are important because it creates a sense of belongingness, oneness, a sense of solidarity, and here cultural identities are important, understandings of the people are important, and there's a processual dimension to it. It is a discursive process. It doesn't happen overnight. it sort of draws from cultural practices, similar lifestyles, shared leadership, ideologies, shared history, and a common sort of understanding of oppression or sort of deprivation, as one might like to put it. And here the role of ideology, the role of organization, the role of symbols, the role of culture and cultural expressions are important. Say for example, songs, poetry, literature and such other factors enable the forging of cultural identities. Now the next cultural factor is the role of emotions. The role of emotions in social movements, an aspect which has been neglected because as I had mentioned right at the beginning, that social movement actors are thought of as rational actors. And therefore this binary between emotion and reason is something that that has persisted not only in social movement analysis but within the larger positivistic framework that one has battled in the social sciences. Now the role of emotions are important because emotions are a part of culture. Emotions are a part of all our activities. People become part of social movements because of emotional reasons. People, social movements go through different cycles of hope and despair, of rage, of anger, of freedom and a sense of achievement, of positive feelings of achievement and so on. Therefore, emotions are, though much neglected, are a very important part of our culture and hence need to be, the role of emotions in social movements also need to be recognized, though in all stages of the social movements need to be recognized. And emotions are very closely connected with framing, emotions are very closely connected with collective identity, and hence emotions play a very important role in social movement analysis. As far as the role of emotions is concerned, I'll just talk, I'll draw examples from the Chinese student movement of 1989, but we could also look at the Nirbhaya rape case in 2014 and how it sort of brought people into the movement because people were so agitated by an act of violation. Similarly, one could look at the Rohit Vemula case in Hyderabad, the death of a Dalit student, and how that sort of sparked off an outrage amongst the student communities. But those examples did not really lead to sustained social movements in India. So here, so therefore I'll draw an example of the role of emotions in the Chinese student movement of 1989, which acted as a kind of trigger to a larger social movement and motivated students to participate in political activity. Coming together of millions of people in Tiananmen Square in 1989 following the death of Hu Yaobang, who was the General Secretary of the Chinese Communist Party and who supported the students' movement. And the students, after he died under mysterious circumstances, students put forth a set of demands to the government, but the government did not pay attention to students' demands. Students were aggrieved, but however they continued to gather at the Tiananmen Square, and it led to for Hu Yaobang's funeral, and it over a period of time millions of people gathered at Tiananmen Square every day and demanded some action from the government. But the government thought that it was getting out of hand, and on May 4th, 1989, it ordered the suppression of student movements by unleashing the military on them and on the protesting students. So many thousands of students who had gathered at the Tiananmen Square died. And that is sort of an example of how emotions brought in not only students but people from different sections of the society together to participate in what is now commemorated as the Tiananmen massacre. Now finally, one would talk of the repertoires of collective action. Now this term, repertoire of collective action, is a term which has been popularized by Charles Tilly, and in designating forms of protests. Now these forms of protests are learned cultural creations. He talked of repertoire of collective action as techniques, strategies of claims making made by the people by participating in, say, sit-ins, strikes, dharnas, blockades, marching naked, laughing at the government officials, suicide as an extreme form, candle marches, hunger strike, and so on. And many of these social movements have used these different forms of collective action frameworks or ways of contention to draw the attention of the state or the authority that they are contesting against. For example, the KRRS undertook the action of laughing, collecting outside Karnataka Assembly and laughing at the ministers when they came in and they entered the assembly. And this, whenever any minister entered or came out, they would openly laugh at them, make fun of them. This action then was taken up and it traveled transnationally and was taken up in anti-globalization protests in Europe and other parts of the world. So this is an example of how repertoires of contention travel, and how repertoires of contention become popular, and how social movements at different points of time, though set apart in space and time, they use these repertoires of contention to protest against the injustice, to protest against the excesses of the state, and use it as a means to achieve their goals. To summarize this particular module, therefore, I would refer to the 4 important ideas that have occurred over and over again in the rendition of this particular module. These are the aspect of framing, in other words, meaning making within social movements, processes of meaning making within social movements, which attract people to social movements and motivate and them to participate in social movements. Then the role of repertoires of collective action, which, as I mentioned just now, are innovative ways of protest which may emerge in a particular context, but which are adopted by social movements in other contexts worldwide, and sort of make the participation interesting and meaningful. Then we have the role of emotions in social movements, which not only act as a form of recruitment, but also act as a form of mobilization for social movement actors. And finally, one also looks at the formation of collective identities, the evolution of collective identities within a movement, which sort of gives particular movements a kind which shapes movements as well as enables the movement to shape the identities of its people, of the participants. For more details, kindly visit the EPG Pathshala module on cultural strategies, techniques of protest in social movements.